I cannot believe the panel that I'm about to introduce. Congratulations, everyone. You have just gathered Larry Summers and Armínio Fraga in the same room to discuss economics in the world and in Brazil. If this doesn't solve our recession, I don't know what will. Armínio Fraga is today the head of the private equity and hedge fund Gávea Investimentos. He has served as the president of our central bank during the FHC administration and is called by many the Alan Greenspan of Latin America. Although it would be just as appropriate, if not more appropriate, to refer to Greenspan as the Armínio Fraga of the North. Professor Summers has served as the president of Harvard University until 2006 and as the Secretary of Treasury during the Clinton administration. He has also served as a director of the National Economic Council for President Barack Obama. Only Larry Summers could possibly manage to have two uncles who are Nobel Prize winners and still be the star of his family. Most people I have met at Harvard throughout the years don't even have two uncles in the first place. But on a more serious note, I stand today before two of my greatest heroes that I have admired throughout the years and recently had the privilege to work more closely with. From credit default swaps to the notion that there are no final victories in life and no final defeats, I will never be able to thank you both enough for all of your time, your trust, and your genius. Without further ado, it's my absolute honor to call to the stage today Dr. Armínio Fraga and my captain, Professor Larry Summers.
Thank you very much, Larissa, and let me just say to you, who I know best, and to the other student organizers of this conference at both Harvard and MIT, it is a remarkable achievement to be able, while attending a full set of classes and all of that, to be able to assemble a conference of this kind that I believe provides an extraordinary opportunity for dialogue on the issues facing Brazil and the world. I think all of us who are here owe a big debt of thanks to the student organizers of this important conference. And let me say, speaking personally, that it's an extraordinary privilege to be here and to have a chance to interview a bit my very good friend, Armínio Fraga. Armínio and I now have known each other for about a quarter century. Armínio was in the private sector during the time of the Mexican financial crisis in 1995. And as you can imagine, we at the Treasury were very concerned to understand exactly what was going on in Mexico, as Armínio, who was trading emerging market debt, was also very concerned to understand exactly what was going on. And so we were often anxious to hear what the markets were learning. And I can report to you that at that time, if I had had my choice as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury between knowing what the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States knew about Mexico and knowing what Armínio Fraga knew about Mexico, I would have chosen Armínio Fraga. We kept in touch, and a number of years later, I found myself engaged with President Cardozo and his team at a very difficult moment for the global economy and for the Brazilian economy following the events in Asia, following the financial crisis in Russia, and at LTCM. And at a moment of maximum danger for your country, after the pegged exchange rate that had been the center of Brazilian economic policy proved to be unsustainable, Armínio Fraga became the central bank governor of Brazil. And his was, I can tell you, a remarkable performance of steadiness under excruciating pressure, wisdom in sorting through extraordinarily complex problems, and courage in confronting the many political currents that run through your country. And he is a person for whom I have enormous admiration. It did not surprise me when he left the central bank that Armínio proved skillful, farsighted, and effective in the private sector, nor that he has maintained his interest in public policy on both a Brazilian and a global basis, where he is a respected and sought-after voice. And so I, who know very little about Brazil, am glad to have the opportunity this afternoon to educate myself by posing a few questions to Armínio and engaging in some conversation, and we're all lucky to get to hear his views. So Armínio, what's gone wrong? I mean, in some deep sense, it's always about the future. In Brazil, the story, I have this sense of deja vu. The story in the early middle years of the Clinton administration was Brazil had a period of a lot of growth that had been really good. Then it kind of lost its way, and when it lost its way, it doesn't do anything in Brazil on a small way, and so it lost its way in a big way. And then it was all kind of being put together, and I think I really believed, BRICS, the first letter in BRICS was B for Brazil, and it was the harbinger in our hemisphere of what was happening for emerging markets. And as recently as 7 or 8 years ago, there were really high hopes for Brazil. There was a sense that there had been a transition of power from President Cardoso, that a representative of the traditional left had governed with more fiscal responsibility than many expected, that there were tremendous industrial and natural resource powerhouses in Brazil, and that Brazil was carried with it the fate of Latin America, and that Brazil was bursting out, and that happy times were ahead for Brazil and beyond. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not a lot, in describing the view a decade ago. And there's been a sense politically, economically, that things have sort of fallen apart. And now there's a sense that they're being put back together again a bit. What's beyond any specific politician or any specific policy decision? help someone who's an outsider sort of understand this from your perspective?
Okay, I was hoping you would help me, but before I jump into this, I'm here blushing furiously. Thank you for your ultra kind words. I'll tell you a quick story about Larry and our relationship in those tough times. I was invited and I accepted during the summer break in Congress. So I had to wait a little bit before taking over at the central bank. Had to be confirmed by the Senate. So I joined Amaury Beer, who was Pedro Malan's right hand, in a trip to Washington, D.C., to discuss with the IMF, the U.S. Treasury, kind of the next steps. They had made a big bet on Brazil at that time, and the bet was that Brazil would have held the line on the exchange rate, would have done a number of other things, and things didn't quite work out. So there was a lot of tension in the air, and we asked for a meeting with Larry, the two of us, and he agreed to have dinner with us. So we went to some hotel in D.C., I don't recall, and they had a private room in the second floor, and Larry was alone. We went in. He locked the door, which we found was made it a little tense. I'm embellishing it here. So what's he going to do? And he grilled us in his polite but relentless and super logical way. And I must say to you, halfway into it, I said, "We're toast. This is not gonna work." So we kind of presented what our plan was, what we were trying to do. We were thinking about this so-called tripod of sort of macro finance, financial discipline, this sort of thing, fiscal discipline, and all the way to the end, probably a couple hours. And at the very, very end, we relaxed for a second, and he said, "Okay, now this is his words," said, "We'll back you up." And I'll tell you, it was one of the most important moments at that point, because we had to start finding some anchors to stabilize things, to stabilize expectations. And this was no easy decision for them, the leaders of, say, the financial world. And I'm very, very grateful. And we left that room with huge enthusiasm for the task ahead. Now, thank you again, Larry. Now, as for us, Brazil, right now, I, like you, had a feeling once President Lula came in and surprised us all with sound policies, pretty much throwing away the Workers' Party program that had been terrorizing everyone who had bothered to read it. And he comes in and does fine, does very well by all standards, including adding to what the previous government had done, as one would expect. I mean, each government is supposed to do a little better than the government that came before. So turbocharging social policies, all that was terrific, while maintaining, macro discipline, which has been a huge historical problem for us. We seem to have every so often a crisis, and it really slows you down if you have to go backwards every now and then, as we have. I thought at that time that we were going to make it. I really thought we had found a path. It was nothing too special, it was sort of conventional. There are things for refocusing the state, worrying about education, about financial stability, fiscal discipline. It felt right at the time. And unfortunately, after a while, I think we just got off track. And this my view on the economic side is that we somehow felt this nostalgia about the years gone by of the 60s and 70s, where Brazil had grown quite fast, and kind of, in a way, went back to some of those ideas. And the trouble is, those ideas didn't work. You know, Brazil then, you may know that Brazil picked the model of a development model that was anchored primarily on import substitution, a very substantial presence of the state in the economy, and including in production, which is still there, but not quite as much. And it just, the model just didn't work. And this was not a model that focused on productivity, on education. Was a major gap during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And never really mobilized enough capital either. And moreover, back then there were further issues, including little concern for poverty and distribution and so on. And I think we got off track. It wasn't quite clear in the beginning because we're going through a commodity boom, a credit boom, and things felt pretty good. But then once we moved into the end of the Lula years, beginning of President Dilma's first term, not only were we at that point somewhat unlucky, or she was, but Brazil even more so, the commodity prices turned, the bubble sort of went away, and then I believe she kept on doubling up on the wrong bets. This ended up in the extreme situation we faced in her election year, when there was total loss of fiscal discipline. And so the macro story kind of speaks for itself. But the other side of this was the new version of the 70s was a model that was named in Brazil with a lot of pomp and circumstance, the new economic matrix. It was a model of providing ample subsidies, tax breaks, protection from foreign competition, cozy contracts, and so on, that just didn't cut it. I just think it was that. Now, the trouble we're facing now is deeper, because this was, in the end, a situation where our state got captured by interest groups of all sorts, private and public party interests as well. So it wasn't just a government or the government coalition that was ruling. I mean, the private sector played a key role. It played along. I mean, the milking of the cow was done jointly by the government and the private sector. They all joined this kind of old-fashioned failed model. And the results are here. I mean, we're going through a massive recession. I would call it a depression. If you look back at the last 5-6 years, to stop soon here, Larry, Brazil's rate of growth was 2.6% per year lower than the rate of growth of our regional peers. And quite frankly, our regional peers are not exactly a very high bar, all right? It includes Argentina, Venezuela. This is dramatic. And then that's kind of where we are now. Right now, we're in a situation where this relationship between the parties, private sector parties, the political parties, and the state is being opened up. And what we see is terrifying. It's not that corruption was invented recently, is obviously not the case, but to see it live in color, in the size, the extent of it, is unbelievable. Now, the good news, in my view, is that this is happening under daylight. So anyway, not to get too far into this, we can get back to this, but I think this could be an important change in regime. There's still huge uncertainty ahead of us, but anyway, I still have hope. But things are, at the moment, in need of huge repair, I'm afraid.
If you were the next president of Brazil, the world would probably be a better place. that was really a device for saying, if you had to list, ideally with some concreteness, like eradicate corruption, we're all for that, but we probably already knew that. And it's probably easier said than done. If you had to list the 3 or 4 most important steps that the next government of Brazil, or the current government of Brazil transiting into the next government of Brazil, need to accomplish over a 3-year period to set the stage for Brazil to enjoy more rapid and inclusive growth, what would they be?
Okay, I put at the top of the list political reform. I don't think we can go on with 30-plus parties. There is no ownership, no focus on long-term issues, no focus on issues for the most part. I think we see some of that. An initial step is on the table. It entails creating what do you call it? Anyway, a clause that would limit the size of parties, or the lower size of parties. So it's an attempt at lowering the number of parties and other issues, including the sorts of coalitions that can take place in majority elections, proportional elections. This, I think, would be my number 1 choice. I would also favor, at some point, although that's not possible in the near term, that's not feasible, something of the sort of the German model of so-called mixed district voting, or something like the like. That, I think, would be a big positive step. I am completely against the idea that's being floated that the parties should have, for the next elections, so-called closed or pre-ordered lists. I know this is a complicated debate. Not everybody agrees with this, even some in the room, but my view is this is a very inopportune model to do this. I mean, to take away the right of the people to rank who they're going to vote, to rank those who will get elected, to me is unacceptable. Maybe later you can do a mixed system where you have half of the list provided by the party and half by the electorate. But that would be my number 1. Number 2, I think there are issues surrounding the fiscal health, not only of the federal government. The states are in very bad shape, including Social Security reform that's now on the table. The proposal was quite good. The negotiations are taking place as we speak, and the proposal seems to be getting weaker every day. We have a system that is just way, way too expensive. We spend like a mature society on Social Security. That's going to have to be redone. And other items related to the fiscal health. Our debt issue is a real threat. And then I think there's a world of economic issues related to the productivity side, the supply side. I won't bother listing, but you name it. You name it. Almost pretty much anything you think of is in some need of repair. It ranges from hugely in need, like our tax system, to somewhat in need, like our labor laws and so on. So there's a lot to do. That's the sort of bad news, but I'm a half-glass full person. So I actually think this is a spectacular opportunity. So if a government were to be elected on the basis of a platform of fixing these things up, I think they could do spectacularly well, and I think the economy would respond also quite well. Is getting there now, that's the issue. This is a moment of huge uncertainty, and it'll take some work and probably some luck too.
Assume that Brazil did a very good job between now and 2020 of implementing a set of political and economic reforms of your choosing, and assume that the world economy was kind of fine in the 2020s, not spectacular, but nothing like the 2008 financial crisis. So reasonable world economy and a really good Brazilian reform package between 2017 and 2020. What do you think is a feasible growth rate for Brazil for the decade of the 2020s?
4% plus. I think our GDP per capita is less than 20% of the U.S. There's just a lot to do, and I think
But why is it, I'm not disagreeing with you, but one could listen to that and say, China's at 20% of the U.S., and if China was going to have 4% growth, it would be regarded as a catastrophe of epic proportions in China. India is somewhat poorer than China, but when people talk about India, they talk about 8% growth. Why is the dream scenario kind of only 4% in Brazil? What is it about? And it's a deep question about Latin America, because, you know, Mexico, I mean, people ask the question, Mexico, you know, leave aside anything that Donald Trump has done in the last few months. You know, Mexico had NAFTA with the United States, and they've integrated with the United States, and, you know, they have a credit default credit spread that, you know, half the time in recent years has been less than that of Italy. And they've privatized oil, and they've done all this stuff. But, you know, I don't know what the number exactly is, but average Mexican growth has probably had a two-handle over the last 15 years. What is it about Latin America that, with the exception of a few moments in Chile, makes Asian-style growth rates in the upper half of the single digits not something that people even sort of aspire to for significant lengths of time? It seems like it's a very important question, for maybe the most important question for Latin America's future, and I've never completely understood it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't rule out growing faster, but I think it would sound crazy at this point as a probabilistic guess. Latin America doesn't have a history of saving much, and therefore also of investing much, and has had to deal with long-dated issues related to a culture of education, of excellence, of trust. There's a deficit in many of these areas. And unfortunately, I don't think these problems that manifest themselves in all kinds of ways in our societies are very easy to cure. Now, 4% with a declining workforce, in our workforce growth will be declining below 1% the next 20 years. So it's pretty good. If you could sustain it, it's a rate at which
Make no mistake.
But
make no mistake, as a friend of Brazil,
yeah.
If I could sign my name right here, and you'd have 4% growth for the next 15 years,
pretty good.
And you'd give up any chance of better, but you'd also give up any risk of worse,
Yeah.
I'd sign my name in a huge hurry.
Yeah,
So I was real, but the question I asked wasn't what you expected Brazil to do.
No.
It was assume you could put in place a great set of policies. And it was that was what I was kind of struck by.
I don't think it'd be possible to put in place all at once. But if you could create a path that people could see that would make us, say, in 10 years have, you know, good quality public education for all our kids, if you could create a path that make people see that they could allocate capital to infrastructure investments in Brazil, those are in huge need, and it would have to be private capital. The government is bust, and doesn't know how to do it anyway. Then I think the sky is the limit. I really do. We also, in this case, by the way, in the near term, in theory, after a huge recession, you would also have some cyclical fat to burn as well. So it's doable, but then you ask the Mexico question. The Mexico economy has issues related to the rule of law, to the still lower quality of their education system, similar challenges that we face, the prisoners of bad ideas, of interest groups. They have a lot of sectors that are are monopolized, the lack of competition. I think that's a harder question for me, is really why Mexico hasn't grown much. I think we have been a victim of our own problems, that are of our own making. These are homemade, man-made crises, and we could undo it. And Mexico, I find equally troubling. So let's say if we're in between Mexico and China, it's okay, I would say, at this point.
Let me ask you a quite different sort of question, if I could, I couldn't have really imagined a year ago that I'd be asking. And it's really for you as a Latin American who's very thoughtful about Latin American, to give us in America some lessons from the Latin American experience. We've got a president who was democratically elected, who ran as a strong man, only I can fix it, who speaks of our national greatness and restoring it, who has a particular affinity, judging by his cabinet, for generals, who believes in a more corporatist than has been traditional in the United States approach to convening businesses and telling them what to do, who is given to somewhat extreme behaviors that get a lot of attention in the tabloids, who is perhaps prone to speak to the will of the people, but to surround himself with a web of people very close to him who seem to be prospering very substantially during his period in government. It all reminds one of various Brazilian government scenarios at various points over the last 50 years, and perhaps of various Argentinian government scenarios, and perhaps other scenarios. And I think it's probably fair to say that nationalist populism has not been a conspicuous economic success over the years in the last couple generations in Latin America. You're also a very thoughtful student of the United States. Is it fair to compare in any way the Trump administration to the nationalist populist traditions in Latin America? How fair is that comparison? What are the lessons that the administration would sensibly heed from the experience of Latin America? I didn't talk about, I probably should have, in drawing the analogy, a tendency, substantial enthusiasm for protectionism and protectionist rhetoric and import substitution as an important element. Maybe you could reflect for us for a couple minutes on the analogy.
Okay, I'm worried. I'm a little less worried now because it doesn't seem to be getting much done. But I am worried exactly for these reasons. I mean, we have an experience with so-called pro-business policies that on the surface seem good, intuitive, but they don't add up. And they easily get captured. And the end results are not good. So, I mean, I'd stay away from that. See, I found it strange when one member of the president's advisory cabinet, business people, I'm not sure what the name was, a CEO of an important company, resigned from this council. And the president said, well, if he doesn't mind losing access to the White House, then, That's his problem. So I mean, the question I ask is, so exactly what is access to the White House providing him with? You know, and I'm of the view that the government needs to set up certain rules of the game, tax rules, etc., so that business people can take care of their businesses. They should stay in their offices, their factories, wherever it is they work, their lofts, and do their thing. And so one thing we learned in Brazil is when business people start showing up in Brasilia a lot, something is wrong. And I would assume over time, even though this is the most amazing country with the most amazing history, that over time this could hurt. I don't like it, I mean, quite frankly, at this point.
You're also a large student, substantial student of global financial development. Beyond your concerns about Brazil, what worries you most looking out at the global financial and economic picture?
Okay, on the financial side, we seem to see a pattern of ever-growing crisis. And we now keep thinking, you know, where's the next one going to take place, and what will happen? Is it China? What is it? And I think there is an issue with finance that we haven't quite come to grips with. I mean, a lot of good reforms seem to be taking place, but I just don't know. I mean, that bothers me. It seems to be something endogenous. The system is not generating these situations out of the blue. Is something built in. And in general, however, I actually worry more about some political trends than economic trends. I think in the near term, yeah, China, okay, but they save 45% of GDP. You can deal with a lot of sins if you save 45% of GDP. If you save 16 or 15 the way we do, it's a lot harder, I'll tell you that. But I'm more worried about the politics. Losing faith in a more integrated, peaceful world, a sort of old sort of Fukuyama end of history paradise seems to be gone, and there are a lot of places where the politics are getting outright ugly with all kinds of disturbing tendencies, authoritarian, populistic, and so on and so forth. That bothers me more. I mean, this is a dangerous world beyond the dangers of finance, and that makes me lose sleep.
Armínio, you've had a remarkable career. You've been a highly engaged and successful participant in financial markets. You've been a public servant at a major juncture for your country. You're respected very broadly for your economic analysis and thoughtfulness. You're a leader in a range of different organizations with respect to a range of different causes. You, like me, I suspect, feel that if somebody had told you when you were 20 that it was going to be 75% as good as it's been, you would have been very pleased. What advice would you give the students in this room who are at a very early stage in their careers, having enjoyed all that you have enjoyed?
That's a good way to try to conclude. I know we have a time limit. I first of all, I join Larry in congratulating all the organizers for this meeting, this conference. They clearly are engaged, so I'm probably speaking to an ultra minority in the universe of students. But I can tell you that back home, I see more people getting engaged in their life as citizens, and some going way beyond, many planning to get engaged directly in a career in politics. And my advice to you is do exactly that. Stay engaged, do your thing, whatever it is, pursue your passion, but be part of something bigger. Be thoughtful about the world you live in. Be thoughtful about who you vote for. Just get involved. And I guarantee you will find this to be very rewarding. And moreover, should you at some point face an opportunity to be in government at whatever level, in whatever area, go for it. It's something that you will find very rewarding. It can be extremely difficult, like most things in life, but you will see it if you follow our advice. I'm sure Larry feels the same, that there's very little in life that is better. Stuff that might be better is probably, or related to your personal lives, finding the right partner, that kind of thing. But besides that, I guarantee you, this is the way to go. And you all clearly have in you this instinct, and I hope you spread the word, and you do more, and you bring more people into this dream, and be positive. I think you no matter how hard the situation, you can find a way out, particularly if you work, if you work together, if you create a critical mass. This is going to happen faster than you think. So that's my 2 cents.
Armínio. Armínio, thank you for your wit, your wisdom, and your humanity, as you've spoken about a range of subjects with us. And I would just say that no one knows the future, but whatever I thought about the future of Brazil at 3 o'clock this afternoon, having seen the intensity, brightness, and size of the crowd that has gathered here today for this important conference, makes me feel better than I did at 3 o'clock today about Brazil's future and the future of the world. It has been an enormous privilege for Armínio and I to be with you all this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Pessoal, a gente ainda tem meia hora de...